As usual, another great guest, but a quick diversion. You'll notice that our full name is the Marketplace for Health, Wealth, and Freedom. Well, let's talk about your health for a moment. If you'd like to escape from the stranglehold of insurance and be able to see alternative doctors or go across state lines for care, then you definitely need to take a look at patientempowerment.mpb.health and see if that's the fix you've been looking for. Now, let's get back to the show.
Welcome everyone to Freedom Hub's weekly webinar. I'm Charlie Froman and my co-host Jim Graypeck is as excited as I am to host this topic because serendipity has made it very timely. Climate alarmism has been with us for a long time, but now with the Great Reset efforts morphing from the failed COVID passport into this new carbon footprint by way of an SEC rule, this event today has become even more relevant. Pat Michaels is someone I've known for a couple of decades when I was the Government Affairs Associate Director at Cato, organizing dozens of fora on Capitol Hill. Pat was a frequent presenter along with Jerry Taylor and Peter Van Orden and others. And one of the simplistic takeaways I took from Pat's presentations, and Pat, as a UVA teacher, you could tell me if I listened well or not, was basically temperatures are increasing marginally, but what can government do to improve it? And you can correct me after we introduce this. What a lot of us also noticed was any scheme to distribute carbon credits seemed like a typical welfare boondoggle for special interest. So it was a hard sell to get anyone that was skeptical of government to buy into any of it. And by the way, what happened to conservation? For hundreds of years, even Ron Paul talked about making polluters pay. That seemed pretty good, something that a lot of folks could get behind, but it was always drowned out by this boogeyman around climate. And it wouldn't go away. So Pat became very popular and well known as the expert on it. He was the climatologist for the state of Virginia. I mentioned teaching at UVA. He's now back in Charlottesville, and he's also gone from Cato. He's at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, CEI, which, like Cato, has done great work for decades on regulatory capture, how it interferes with competition. As I mentioned, the issue has become more important now with the behavioral control efforts of the Great Reset elitists. And the fear is with this new Security and Exchange Commission rule, the banks are going to monitor our purchases for what's called a carbon footprint and control our behavior indirectly that way. Another issue that will probably come up today is the politicization of energy around geopolitics. Energy is under Pat's expertise as well. And let me just bring in my co-host Jim quickly, because a lot of folks with empathy in their hearts bought into the climate change worry. In fact, Jim's a big media guy. And what happened to you, Jim, long ago?
Well, I guess I bought into Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth. I don't know if that started it, but I got on the bandwagon and I produced a commercial out of my own pocket, on my own dime, with my kids who were like 4 and 5 at the time. It was very cute. I bought media ads. I put this in like some major markets that we needed to go back to the Paris climate talks. It made it into Europe because my wife was Danish. Well, for other reasons, I mean, we got tremendous viewership. But then I started noticing, I'm reading research from universities, other places that are talking about, that are basically refuting what I just did, the whole narrative. And then since then I realized I got scammed, basically. And here I am.
And with that, Pat, why don't you go ahead and press screen share and take it away.
I will press screen share in a second. Thanks, Jim. That's a unfortunately very common story. When people start to look into this seriously, they wind up asking critical questions that don't seem to jive with the narrative. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about this notion that CO2 emissions cost us something, and that each and every one of us has something called a carbon footprint, meaning the amount of carbon dioxide emissions that we put out per day or per year, and how this is used and abused in the policy sphere, both in Washington and around the world. So let's see if I can get the screen share to work right. Here we go. Screen share. Okay, let's try this. There we go. Okay, great. All right. Well, this is, I'd like to entertain you with my fading voice for a few minutes, talking about climate models, reality, and policy. What is the social cost of carbon dioxide? And for that, we could substitute your carbon footprint for social cost of carbon. So here's how it goes. This is supposed to move forward an image. There we go. These are various social costs of carbon, two of them. One from the Biden administration, which says $51 in today's dollars for each ton of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere. And when the Trump administration came to town, the Biden figure is the same as the Obama figure, which shouldn't surprise anyone. When the Trump administration came to town, it looked at some of the assumptions under the previous administration's figures and found that they were too high. They had a sensitivity of temperature to carbon dioxide that was too high. But moreover, they used an emissions scenario. Hey, let me ask you guys a question out there. How many people have any idea what the energy structure of our society is going to be like in the year 2100, which is 3/4 of a century from now? And the answer is none of you do. I don't. 100 years ago, if I would have said that we would be flying around in aluminum tubes at 600 miles an hour and have a little box in our pocket that could access all the information in the world, you would have said I'm crazy. But that's the way the world changes. And yet, the projections for the cost of carbon dioxide and the emissions of carbon dioxide are assumed with some certainty over the course of the next 100 years. Well, what assumptions do we normally make? The assumption that's made is generally something called RCP 8.5. That is representative concentration pathway 8.5, or its offspring. And that means that the emissions that we're putting in the atmosphere will raise the downwelling radiation, which warms the surface, in the atmosphere by 8.5 watts per meter squared. That's a big number, and it's much larger than any of the numbers that are in different scenarios. It is referred to as the quote business as usual scenario by people who don't understand that there's no such thing as business as usual. Obviously, the present and the future belong to the efficient. So there will be increasing pressures to produce things efficiently. RCP 8.5 does not comport with that. We are sitting on literally hundreds of years worth of natural gas simply under our feet. If we just break the rocks down there, natural gas emits about half of the carbon dioxide that coal does when used for electrical generation. Yet RCP 8.5 assumes a dramatic increase in the consumption of coal and no dramatic increase in the consumption of natural gas. Two things that are obviously wrong. So some people have been getting pretty mad about this, including some of our greener friends. And in the image that you're looking at, I would count Zeke Housefather of the Breakthrough Institute as one of our much greener friends. And he basically he wrote an article in Nature in 2020, and this is the lead in to the article, quote, "Stop using the worst case scenario for climate warming as the most likely outcome. More realistic baselines make for better practice." Yet hundreds and hundreds, the vast majority of papers on climate change and its impacts, meaning impacts on agriculture, impacts on economies, making your life more miserable or whatever, they all assume the wrong scenario. So here's a look from Housefather and Peters at the scenario that's being used. This is the one that all the papers use, virtually all of them. They label it, in their words, in bold, highly unlikely. This is RCP 8.5. Worst case, no policy scenario, i.e. coal grows and grows and grows, natural gas does not. The average no policy scenario is 4 degrees C. They call that unlikely because it assumes basically no new technologies. Generally speaking, their likely scenarios are between 1.5 and 2.5 degrees C by the year 2100, or an RCP of around 4.5. Now let's take a look at a little bit of history here, just for the heck of it. Let's look at global warming. This is the most cited of the surface temperature records. It comes from the Hadley Center at the University, working with the University of East Anglia, Climate Research Unit. This is version 4, so this is HAD-CREW T4. And one of the things you can see in this record is that beginning around 1850, nothing much happens. And around 1910, a warming ensues, which goes to about 1945. Now, in older climate records, remember these data are all massaged. Some might say they are massaged to the point of being molested. Earlier records have the period back here as warmer than it is, and the period up here as cooler than it is. But each one of the dozens of adjustments, except for one, that have been applied to this data, instead have cooled the data down here, warmed the data here, and gotten rid of what was actually a negative trend from 1945 to the mid-1970s here. This is unfortunately the history of science a la Thomas Kuhn in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions writ large. Basically what Kuhn said is most scientists spend their life trying to cram data into a paradigm that they've been taught to believe in. And it is only the very few, grumps, maybe like me, who say, well, wait a minute, actually the data don't quite fit. But here's an interesting thing about this record. The warming from 1910 to 1945 in slope is not significantly different than the warming from the late 1970s to around the year, let's say the late 1990s or so. So is this one caused by carbon dioxide as well as this one? Well, that's what the United Nations assumes. It's what the US government assumes in its reports called National Assessments of Climate Change. And it's obviously wrong. It's so obviously wrong as to be laughable. The CO2 concentration of the atmosphere back here when this record begins is somewhere around 284 parts per million. By the time it begins to warm up, it's around 298 parts per million. So the assumption that this is caused by CO2 means that a mere change of 13 parts per million in atmospheric CO2 could begin to induce a 0.5 degree Celsius of warming. By the way, the concentration that we're at today, way out here, is somewhere around 415 parts per million. I submit to you, if this were caused by CO2, then the temperature here would be somewhere off this screen. Obviously, that is the wrong assumption to make. There are other ways of looking at temperature that give us perhaps a more accurate and certainly a more global view. This is the satellite temperature history from Roy Spencer and John Christie. Roy of NASA and Christie of the University of Alabama at Huntsville. Satellites were put up in 1978 to measure microwave radiation coming from the surface of the Earth, which is easily transferable into mean column temperature. And what to see in the satellite record is a warming that is much less than the surface. It's about 0.13 degrees per decade. The surface temperature record is warming at about 0.18 degrees per decade. And for what it's worth, the computer models that all these policies are based upon, which are reposited with the United Nations and the US Department of Energy, predict it should be warming over 0.3 of a degree per decade now, in the last decade, in the coming decade. I can't put this more discreetly. Those models are wrong. And we know why they're wrong. That's beyond the scope of this talk, but they're just wrong. Okay, fine. It's not beyond the scope of this talk. Every few years, our Department of Energy runs something called a Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, CMIP. And each one of these is shoehorned into whatever is the next United Nations climate report. Seen as the 6th climate assessment from the UN is not quite complete yet. The only complete one we have is the 5th one, which goes back to 2013. And here is the difference between the models and the observations. Each piece of colored spaghetti on here is a model or model average from one of these acronymed modeling groups around the world. You will notice, by the way, that every one of these models is run by a government. There's no private industry models that are in the CMIP models. There's no simple models that base themselves upon observed temperature and carbon dioxide changes, say, for the last 50,000 years. They're not in there. These are all government productions. And you can't have worked for Cato and CEI for as long as I have and not be suspicious of something that is a worldwide government production. Anyway, the red solid line is the average of all of these models. And so it says that the warming from 1979, when the satellite first goes up, to now, which would be here, would be somewhere on the average of about 1.5 degrees Celsius. These little blocks down here, the colored squares and circles, that's something called reality. They are 3 different sets of observations. One, the satellite data, which are the squares. The circles are the averages of weather balloon temperatures. You know, every day around the world, we send up weather balloons twice a day at the same time to get a 3-dimensional picture of the atmosphere. And that data is used to initialize the weather forecast models from around the world. What's interesting about that data is it is standard procedure to calibrate the thermistors before the balloon is launched. So they are highly accurate. And what you see is that the weather balloons, which are the squares, are the circles, pretty much match the satellites. And then there's the diamonds, which are something called reanalysis. That's a new data set that objectively fills in the holes where there aren't any data with a dynamic rather than a statistical model. And you can see in reality that these things just don't comport to what's going on. So how do we deal with that? Well, wait a minute. These models are so good that one of them just won the Nobel Prize. October 5th, 2021, Suki Manabe of the Princeton Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory got the Nobel Prize, the first one ever given in atmospheric science. And of course, there's no politics in the Nobel Prize. After all, we understand its origin. And it was given, quote, for the physical modeling of the Earth's climate, quantifying variability, and reliably predicting global warming. Wow. Manabe got the prize for creating one of the first models at the Department of Commerce's Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, and it says it reliably predicts global warming. I don't think the committee really did its homework very well. Let's see how reliable it is. Now, here's a piece of colored spaghetti that's sure to bore everyone. This is actually analogous to the previous one. It's the CMIP-5 models, but now starting at the surface here and going up in the vertical. Atmospheric scientists like to use pressure altitude rather than height altitude, but roughly 100,000 units here is the surface, 50,000 units up here would be halfway up through the atmosphere by volume. And by the time you get on up to 20,000 units, 80% of the atmosphere is below you. And here are the changes in temperature predicted by all those models, the same ones you saw before, in the CMIP-5 study. Those are the colored spaghetti. And there are two things that stand out. One, all the predictions are far above what's observed. These are the observed values at the different heights right here, except for one model. This here is the Russian model, INM-CM4, which predicts less warming than all of the other models. Well, in fact, if we go back and we look carefully at the mean temperature predicted by these over the three-dimensional atmosphere, lower atmosphere, here's all the colored spaghetti. And if you look carefully, you'll see one piece of colored spaghetti, in fact, corresponds to reality. That is the INM-CM4. So we have a model that works, but who gets the Nobel Prize? Well, where is the GFDL, Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory model from Manabe et al.? It happens to be right here, as you can see, the orange line, which is right here. And it is so bad that it is completely off the chart. It literally does not fit on the chart when you plot up all the models. That's kind of remarkable. It tells something a lot about the way science is done. So let's talk about the world we have, and then settle back on the social cost of carbon and your carbon footprint. It's warmed up. You saw that from the slide from the Hadley Center. It's warmed up both the surface. Now, aloft, the warming is predicted to be on average about over maybe 0.43 degrees C per decade. And the observed value is a little bit around close to 0.15. So warming is being over predicted in the troposphere by a factor of 3 at least. Meanwhile, what we've been doing is we're putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which has the effect of warming the coldest temperatures of winter and night more than the warmest temperatures of summer and the day. I actually published that paper back in 2000. And so you might think, well, you know, we read all this stuff about, well, agriculture is suffering, less food is being produced because of global warming and all that stuff. People who say things like that, unfortunately, are functioning in a rather data-free environment. This is global crop production back to around 1980 or so. This is the 4 major crops: corn, wheat, soybeans, and rice. And you can see something very interesting. It's increasing exponentially. It's a low order exponent, but the deviations from the exponent are vanishingly small. In fact, simply running a second order curve through this data fits 99% of the data. It's assumed, maybe not necessarily correctly, that the deviations from this smooth trend are due to year fluctuations in weather. A one-year fluctuation is weather. A multi-year fluctuation is climate. There's a difference between the two, but you can see it continues to go up as an exponent. So we've created a planet which is warming, not very much, and is getting greener. In fact, here's how much greener it's getting. This is probably the landmark paper on this, even though it's over 6 years old now, by Zhu et al., published in Nature magazine in 2016, where they looked at satellite data that's been going on actually since the late 1970s, measuring how green the planet is. This mumbo jumbo here is basically simply a measure of greenness. And where it's orange or hotter, the planet is becoming less green. Where it's green or blue or up to purple is becoming green. In fact, much, much more green. It's a tremendous increase in green dry matter accumulating on the ground. And I'd like to take a look at this with you if we can. You will notice that the areas that are greening up the most are the tropical rainforest of northern and north central South America, the tropical rainforest of Africa, and the tropical and Icelandic rainforests of East Asia and the Western Pacific Islands. These are the so-called lungs of the world that are being damaged by global warming and civilization. Well, in fact, they're prospering and thriving more than any other place. Where there are little stipples on this map, the changes are statistically significant. And one of the things you see on this map, besides the fact that it's pretty much greening up everywhere, is there is virtually no significant browning, meaning figures less than 0 on this map as you go through it. And Zhu et al. Did a factor analysis to say, hey, what's causing this greening? 70% of it was from carbon dioxide itself. You put more CO2 in the atmosphere and plants grow better. That's why commercial greenhouses increase the concentration of CO2 in the greenhouse between about 3 and 5 times above what it is in the current atmosphere, and things grow better. 9% of it is from nitrogen deposition. That's basically deflation from fertilizer deposition. That makes things grow better. 8% is climate change directly. If you look at this map carefully, up here in the high northern latitudes where there isn't much of a growing season, things are doing quite a bit better. And so if you warm that up, you're going to make it greener. And 4% is land cover change, which should be familiar for anyone who lives in the eastern United States, which used to be open farmland generally around the year 1900, and now has been taken over by a jungle. Our vegetation is, to say the least, luxuriant. So 91% of the greening of this planet is caused by human activity. Wait a minute, is this factored in the estimates for the cost of carbon, social cost of carbon, or factored in to your carbon footprint? The answer is no, not never. Well, some of us decided to actually do that. With Kevin Dyeratna and Ross McKittrick, we published a paper in Economic Policy early in 2020. And when we used the observed warming versus the predicted warming, and we used the greening effect that shows up in things like Zhu et al., we got a social cost of carbon that was negative, i.e., it's a benefit. And if we run the model through the 21st century, we find that the social cost of carbon will stay negative through the majority of this century. And frankly, by the time we're on out to the year 2100, if you believe anything I'm saying, you're gullible, because I don't believe anything I'm saying about the year 2100. The assumptions we made are actual historic discount rates. The Obama administration and now the Biden administration assumes a discount rate of between 2 and 3%. That will make sure that every president is a one-term president. People don't like that. The historical discount rate on securities investments, if you go to the New York Stock Exchange back to the year 1900, is 7%. And in fact, the Office of Management and Budget in 2003 recommended that all people who are looking at regulatory impact assume, among others, a discount rate of 7%. So we did that. And then we changed the greening, et cetera, to what's realistic. And what we got was a negative social cost of carbon. So here we have a very interesting problem, if I could. We have an administration pushing a carbon footprint and a social cost of carbon that really isn't justified in the real world. In the real world, which should be obvious, after all, our life expectancy is over double what it was in the industrialized societies, over double what it was from 1900 to now. Our per capita wealth in constant dollars has increased 12-fold since 1900. It's hard to believe that carbon dioxide and global warming is a net negative given those realities. And yet this continues. And I will leave it to people to ask questions about why it continues and what we can do about it. I just like to say that the social cost of carbon is probably negative, and that's as obvious as looking out your window or looking at your 401k. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Pat. That was a slam dunk, and really helpful and timely. It's a confusing issue when folks just hear one side from the media. So those graphs are damning.
I do have a bunch of others that are in that file that are designed to answer what I think are likely questions to come up. So if people want those graphics, I will send them to you and you can make them available to anyone who wants to look at them.
Excellent. Pranav has a chat comment. Pranav, if you want to unmute yourself and ask that, let's use that as the initial discussion.
Well, no, yeah, great, great presentation. I was just patting myself on the back in my comment that, I work for a major company I won't name, but I was able to find some very skeptical sources on both ESG and climate assessment models. These are startups that are using global climate models for long-term prediction and saying that the risk to the building, this asset, this plant is, going to increase or not based on these long-term models. Anyway, I just listed a couple of those articles and I found sources that people would accept. And it just felt like, for a very large company with a global presence, I was able to make a little difference in my corner to bring skepticism to both ESG and climate change. So anyway.
Explain ESG, Pranav.
Well, environmentally, socially acceptable. So it used to be called SRI more commonly, socially responsible investing. And I forget, ESG is environment, social, governance, I believe.
Governance is correct, yes.
Yeah. So anyway, I just was pleased at myself, and that's all.
Pranav,
ESG is actually worth commenting on. It's the cudgel that is used to beat everyone up into feeling guilty and paying taxes and having a reduced quality lifestyle because of their carbon footprint, which is of course mitigated via the social cost of carbon. There's no law that says that ESG is supposed to regulate corporations. But given the current political situation in Washington, and I don't think I'm being cynical, we live in a lawless environment. And so the Securities and Exchange Commission in the last couple of days has decided that companies, publicly traded companies, maybe the one you work for, Pranav, have to submit what is their carbon liability, if you will, in terms of ESG. This is, of course, a joke because the metrics that are used for it are humorous, to say the least, if you followed my talk. But what's happening is the Securities and Exchange Commission is taking place of the legislative rule to create regulations. No doubt, and I have zero doubt, that what they're doing is going to be trashed by the Supreme Court when it gets up there, in the same way that the Obama administration said, well, gee, it's too bad the Congress doesn't want to go along with us to, make energy so expensive that people won't use very much of it. So we're going to have the EPA do it. And they created something called the Clean Power Plan. And in his last significant judicial act, Justice Scalia polled the Supreme Court and determined that any challenge to the Clean Power Plan was liable to be sustained because it is not just unconstitutional, it's extra constitutional. The same thing is going to happen to the SEC trying to regulate via the ESG strictures on industry. But it will make life miserable for many. In the meantime, it will make energy more expensive. That gasoline pump out there, that price was not set by Vladimir Putin. It was more set by making it very difficult to drill for the absolute abundance of shale oil and gas that lies beneath the surface of the United States. Prices related to supply. And believe me, we could supply just as much as the former Soviet Union does or did easily. We were a net exporter of energy and the largest creator of fossil energy in the world when we had a president that, last president that we had, that was certifiably, at least modestly sane. I choose my words carefully, Charlie.
That was good. Can you, before Jim, can you just give the details? SEC rule. I sent around a pretty alarmist piece on it because, I think as a teacher myself, I taught in DC's inner city for a few years. Provocation wakes people up and makes them think a little bit. The provocative Substack interpretation of the SEC coming rule was that the banks would be used to monitor purchases around someone's carbon footprint. So it would lead to the behavioral control, which is the common theme between the vaccine passport, the digital currency, the footprint. How do you see implementation of the SEC rule? I mean, before it gets knocked down by the Supreme Court, like with the vaccine mandate, it's going to ruin a lot of people's lives for a good few months, half a year or so.
Well, I sure as heck, I don't mean to be too stereotypical, but there are lots of elderly retirement age people that have a lot of investments either directly in their 401ks or via funds in their 401ks that are in energy related companies, ExxonMobil, for example. And the idea here, by the way, and the clever thing about the SEC is it's really not asking what's climate change going to do for you. There's a subtext, which is what's climate change regulation going to do to you? So it was just to raise the specter of the government ruining these companies for all these stockholders. Believe me, this is as close to a political suicide machine as I can imagine. And given the way Washington's going, that's quite a statement.
Jim, go ahead. We'll come back to this. This is an important topic.
Yeah, I can. I'm in shock.
What are you shocked about?
No, we've been in shock for 2 years. So yeah. In my research, I'm actually finding from a number of sources or have discovered that there could very well be not only global cooling coming, but a mini ice age. Solar activity is never, it's at an all-time low, dating back to last time was in the 1800s. So that's one of my questions, if there's anything you have to say about that. And the other piece is I work with inventors a number of years back and know a couple of guys that have what I guess is commonly called free energy devices or 0 point energy devices. And I had one. I mean, there was something you didn't need to, once it started, you didn't need to put fuel in, and it would generate power, electricity. And there's a lot of stuff online about that. And that's obviously not, I mean, most people don't even know this exists. Certainly not factored into any of the models you're talking about. We could be doing this, but these people, most of them, the real people that have been shut down, you know, it's been suppressed. Of course, it doesn't really fit with the corporate, it's a disruptor to the corporate model. So just wanted to get your feedback on any of this.
Okay, well, I see two questions here.
Yeah.
One about the possibility or probability of a significant near-term global cooling. And the other one is something about the first law of thermodynamics, which we can get into. But and let's start off with that first one. We like to read that solar activity, meaning sunspot activity, is extremely low in a historical perspective. And in fact, the last time that it was that low was beginning around 1610, soon after the invention of the telescope. And people did track sunspots beginning then. It's a little counterintuitive, but when the sun is spotted with these black spots, it's actually hotter and emitting more energy to the planets than it would if it were free of these spots. Well, unfortunately, solar activity appears to have picked up very recently quite a bit, which is why we are seeing multiple reports of nightly aurora displays. And frankly, I hope it goes back to where it was in the early 1990s when we had displays that were visible as far south as the deep south in the United States and were spectacular even at that latitude. I'm not a big solar buff, if you will. I know that the changes in solar output by themselves are not really enough to induce large changes in surface temperature. They have to be amplified by another mechanism. And I'm sure you know, Jim, that the mechanism is thought to be cosmic rays, that the solar activity modulates cosmic rays, which modulates the high cloud cover around the Earth. There is experimental evidence for this. One piece of experimental evidence in a cloud chamber study in CERN in, I believe it's Switzerland. One piece of evidence, not enough for this guy. So I'm not going there. I need to see a lot more on this before I buy it. But I've always been a reluctant buyer of, climate change mechanisms. Number two, you're talking about, refresh me again exactly what it was.
These called 0 point energy devices.
Okay, yeah, well, there's no such thing. I mean, unless the first law of thermodynamics doesn't work and you get something for nothing. I'll put it this way. If you're right, it should be somewhat possible, in fact, probable for all of us to live forever because we will somehow conquer entropy. My lower back is living testimony to entropy. Trust me on this. I haven't conquered it and nobody else has. So I'm a little skeptical of that.
Okay, I can send you stuff offline. I'd be happy.
Yeah, be happy. I'm for sure. Please do.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
We'll have a Tesla guy get really down the rabbit hole later on. Pat, my turn. A couple questions, but I want to hog the film here. Let's see which one. What about conservation? You're hung up having to be the bad news guy on climate change all the time, but there's important work to do for clean air, clean water, and clean land, conservation. Do you ever comment on that to get folks more focused on things that are important?
Well, conservation is such an obvious residual from a prosperous society that if you want to be efficient and clean, you want to be rich. Just take a look. I mean, it doesn't just apply at the national level. It applies at the state level, at the city level, at the neighborhood level. The poorer the neighborhood is, the dirtier it is. The cleaner it is, the prettier it is. Gee, why is that? Because environmental protection is a little bit beyond the basic survival mechanism. And when you have enough wealth that you've taken care of the more emergent things, you switch to environmental protection, which I will therefore make a bold prediction. It's not going to be too long in the future before China cleans up its air dramatically. Why? Because they will be wealthy enough to afford it. The United States was the first country in the world to really clean up its air in the late 1950s and early 1960s. If you look at Pittsburgh, the buildings were black with the smoke from coal and the steel mills. That air was cleaned up because we could afford to. And the political process was so strong that it produced things like Earth Day, Lenin's birthday, that's April 22nd, and gave rise to the Environmental Protection Agency, which was the legislation for that was signed into law by none other than Richard M. Nixon. Well, Europe followed about a decade later, and it's really obvious. It was really obvious to me in traveling to Europe in the 1990s that they still hadn't gotten anywhere close to where the United States was in terms of air quality and things like that. Now they're pretty close to there. What do you think is going to happen with China? They're going to go the same route. So conservation and efficiency are the residual of economic vibrancy. What can I say? If you want those things, let free markets reign.
Good point. Linda?
Yes, thank you for your presentation. You know that the founder and president of Greenpeace resigned because of all those stories about the climate change. My question is, every day I am in Baltimore, we have airplanes going on the sky with those chemtrails throwing down on Earth and in our brains, in our body, those chemicals, aluminum, and all those toxic elements, which poison us. And the reason is that those chemtrails reduce temperature. What's your position on this?
Well, the standard airplane contrail is ultimately an ice crystal cloud. And under certain conditions, and I have taken pictures of this, I have seen the entire sky full overcast, and every one of those clouds was caused by a jet plane at 30,000 feet. Those are water vapor. The chemtrails notion is extremely fringy. I've seen nothing on it that convinces me. So I don't want to go there, but I will say that it is well known that the clouds that are produced by airplanes, the water vapor clouds, which are ice crystal clouds, they're real, obviously, and they have a radiative effect on the surface. They warm the surface. They don't cool it. They emit more radiation through from the sun than they block on the way back up. So they actually are slight net warmers.
I did an experiment that was in Greece years ago, because when I fly and there are clouds, over the clouds, there are planes like 4 in a row going and throwing something, not the normal exhaustion from the planes. And then when I was in Athens, I saw everywhere it was some water with some white material on the surface. I took this material for examination in a special lab, and it was heavy metals, and most of it was aluminum, which, because it was light, it was on the surface of any type of water. So I am scared more about the chemtrails than climate change. What to tell you?
Well,
I don't know.
You know, we all choose the things that we worry about. That one's not high on my list because I don't understand what the source would be. Jet fuel combusts mainly to carbon dioxide and water vapor. It doesn't combust to heavy metals. So the implication, or even light metals, the implication of what you're saying is somehow someone is feeding impurities into the combustor of a jet engine. And I don't understand why that would be economical or desirable, frankly, and I don't understand why anybody would do it.
I tell you, those planes are empty. They have no passenger and seats, and they have huge barrels with the chemicals, and all of them were thrown down in the atmosphere.
All right, well, that's not Patrick's bailiwick, and we've had Jim Lee from Climate Viewer present on this, and we'll have him back. Paul, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for a great presentation. I love anybody who's really driven by the data. It's very important. And so I thank you for your charts. I'd love to be able to study them more carefully. So if you can get them to Charles, I'd like to take another careful look. Now, look, this is a whole story that's been handed down to people over a long period of time. And we're right here at the local level. I live in Petaluma, California. And we actually are going through climate change policy all through our city. And we got a whole climate action committee and the whole deal. They're all fully bought in. Okay. And so, you know, this is kind of what goes on. You have this one big
it's unfortunate.
and you pass it all along. And then we have the Agenda 21 happening right before our very eyes. You know, stack them and pack them and put them all together in these big, tall buildings so you can control them. And then we're going to start transferring wealth. Your message is very important. Obviously, you're getting it out to your audience, which is lobbying there in Washington, D.C. How is it that we can get this out broader to try to, to the local level so they can understand that you should have more healthy skepticism in your policymaking? That's a very clear conclusion from your presentation.
Well, I think that's true. You could, get a copy of this particular little presentation and send it to your city council or whatever it is, or board of supervisors, and they'll look at it and they will say, well, the guy who said that can't be right because he doesn't agree with us, or, he's a tool of industry or something like this. When the arguments go ad hominem, and they do very rapidly in this bailiwick, as I'm sure you're aware, you might as well discount what the arguer is saying when the argument goes, when the arguer goes to an ad hominem position. Force them to confront facts, force them to look at that satellite data, force them to look at the model behavior versus reality and say that that's wrong. Go tell John Christie and Roy Spencer. Spencer won, quote, special award from the American Meteorological Society decades ago for assembling the satellite data. Just tell them they're wrong, and tell them you got something better, and let's see what you got. We'll
okay. Well, that's excellent advice. I have another question about something I hear a lot in California. We have a number of, out of control wildfires. And, they say
because you have out of control wild land.
Yeah. Well, so they try to make this argument that this is all coming from climate change, and that's another reason why we have to knuckle under and do all these policies because of all these bad fires. Well, I'd be honest with you. We have people who actually do a good job on the ground finding data regarding these fires. Mm-hmm. And you will find that the bad fire, first one that I really followed carefully, 2017, you can see the ignition points of the fires. The ignition points of the fires are not one or two spots that then spread from there. They are 50 to 75 different spots all throughout the area. Those are the ignition points. and they are little dots. And do we have an arsonist go around and hit all those spots? No, we did not. And so what we do have is we have evidence of stuff coming down from the sky. So this is directed energy coming down to hit the tinder dry grass. We have pictures of it.
Well, one of the things you have a lot of low-hanging power lines because PG&E had to divert money that would normally be used for maintenance to solar energy and windmills because, you know, California is kind of a weirdly socialist state with regard to its energy structure. And the other thing is that people didn't take care of what's underneath. I'm sure that you have seen the video of this family driving through the Paradise Fire to get out of it.
Yeah.
In the northeast of Chico in California.
Yep.
I don't know if you've taken a good close look at that to see how thick, how high, how dense the understory vegetation is. It's crazy. It should have been cleared out years ago. That was an inferno waiting to happen. And unfortunately, that's the way it is over much of the West. It's not managed right because, you know, I mean, if we want to really blame somebody for things like this, don't blame climate change, blame Bambi.
Oh, no, I wouldn't blame Bambi at all. I think I would blame
Bambi ignited the forest fire suppression movement, meaning
okay.
Bambi ignited creating these large amounts of fuel on the forest floor, literally.
There's no doubt that there's a large amount of fuel, and it's no doubt that it's tinder dry. Now, the issue then gets down to the ignition points. Bambi did not ignite. So the whole point is you have to kind of sit down and go, well, that's a time bomb waiting to blow up. And so, gee, that looks convenient to us. Could we do it? Look, there's many points of evidence that we have to grapple with to figure out what to do. But your data gathering and your analysis, in my opinion, is excellent. And I'm going to do exactly what you said. I'm taking it right forward to my city council. We've had success at our city by stacking the public record with good, truthful evidence. And
that's great.
Yeah, and I want to do the same for what you've just presented. So thank you.
More power to you. Charles, make sure I get to those images, okay?
Yeah, and Pat, we're out of time, so why don't you tell folks sort of a final message. I was going to ask you also just to comment more about that Kuhn guy, about the corruption of science. I think there's a common theme among a lot of different controversial issues that regulatory capture has happened with science.
Yes.
And if you could just comment on that as you make a final comment, how folks can reach you and what your final message is.
Well, let's talk about regulatory capture first. In atmospheric science, it's all government funding. 99.999% at least is from the government, and the largest government funder of that research is the US government. Money does not escape Washington and wind up in the pockets of universities without strings attached. I assure you, if people were sending proposals in saying, well, this is an overblown issue and you ought to save your money, they'd never be funded. So the way research gets funded is to say the world's coming to an end, and you have the research to show it. You've probably done it before you applied for the money, and therefore the world will come to an end, give me more money. However, quote, more research is needed. On the second point, which was, if you'll go back to me, Charles.
Well, the corruption of science.
Oh, sure.
Cover that. And then your final goodbye and what your takeaway message is for all of us.
Well, my takeaway message is, as long as we can, we're all going to live and prosper unless we do something like commit, revolutionary energy related suicide. I realize there are some people in Washington, D.C. who have taken that pill, but my feeling is that the regulatory world in DC has so overreached that there is going to be a real electoral stomping that's going to occur this November. And again, possibly 2 years from now, but certainly there is going to be no legislative ability left in Washington, DC to mess with you. And so all the regulations are going to come from the agencies like the SEC they will ultimately be deemed unconstitutional. These guys are at a low point and they know it, which is why they're getting so nasty.
And how folks can reach you?
Well, you can always go pat.michaels. That's pat.michaels at cei.org. You can look at the CEI web page, Competitive Enterprise Institute. That's www.cei.org. The blog postings on there are actually somewhat interesting, particularly on this subject. So I would go there and keep on going.
So what about your wealth? If your money could actually talk to you, would you listen to it? Well, with the DNA Network Academy, your money actually can talk to you, and it's going to tell you just what it told this client. This family had over 24 debts, mortgages, car loans, the works. They were on track to take 20 years to pay it all off and instead did it in 8.5. Plus, they did it without refinancing, making more money, or even changing their lifestyle. So find out for yourself with a free analysis that is completely confidential. No personal information, no social security numbers, no credit checks, none of that nonsense. But what is exciting is that the outcome of that report you receive is a guaranteed outcome for you. To get that report, head on over to bit.ly/debt to wealth. You will arrive at this simple form. Fill it in as simple as lender number 1 and credit card number 2. What really matters is the accuracy of your numbers. You'll be able to see that if instead of 20 years or whatever your number is, that you may actually be out of debt and on your way to wealth in as little as 6.3 years like this client.